What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the games that I've reviewed this year that were better than expected. Focusing mostly on new releases, of course, but obviously going into some games based on your expectations. Some of them tend to blow them out of the water, others tend to make less of an impact, let's say. But to mention what I usually say at the beginning of any type of video like this, a couple of notes. One, for these types of videos where I normally do like 5 of a given subject, for this type of thing I don't like to inflate that number or add an entry for the sake of hitting 5 or anything like that. So in this case we have 4 simply because these are the games that for one reason or another stood out to me in some way and obviously were better than I expected. But just purely off of that alone, it's important to remember that your expectations going into a game will often determine your general reaction to something. For instance, there's many games this year that I know people are almost certainly going to mention in the comments, but if I go into a game expecting it to be great, and it is great, then my expectations have been met, not exceeded. And what tends to get, in my experience, the most visceral reactions out of people is games that they expected to enjoy or be great, and they actually just turned out to be okay. People usually get much more upset about that than if a game is just outright bad, or if it was bad and they expected it to be bad. So again, expectations tend to shape experiences when it comes to this kind of thing. And with all of that said, let's actually dive into this and talk about some of these games that were better than I expected. Kicking it off with perhaps the easiest one by far is obviously Oblivion Remastered, because it is easy to exceed expectations when you weren't expecting a game to release to begin with, to be honest. So Oblivion is a huge deal to me. If you watched my review of the original game just from last year, actually, sort of retrospective on Oblivion, and then, of course, my review this year for Remastered, you'd likely know that. But rumors about the remaster had been swirling since some documents from that court case leaked it, and it was mentioned that it was in the works in some capacity. But obviously things change, plans change. The year that it was supposed to release came and went. So there was a lot of speculation about this, and then obviously they wound up shadow dropping it. But then, much to my surprise, they mostly kind of nailed it. In fact, if you watched my, I think it was a first impressions video, I believe exactly what I said was that it feels like they threaded an incredibly small needle, because it would have been so easy to do this and kind of lose the feeling of Oblivion. And miraculously, to me at least, it feels like they actually managed to retain exactly that while also updating the things that needed to be updated without making it feel like it was a different game entirely. Now, on one hand, some of those things were easily identifiable. That is to say, things like the leveling system were pretty universally panned, and obviously that's something you would want to address. Other stuff, like, for instance, simply adding more voice actors to replace some of the more common lines while retaining the more iconic lines for, of course, the bigger characters, was a really smart move. And for all of those reasons and many more, Oblivion Remastered wound up being much, much better than I expected it to be, not only because it released, but also the actual quality of the game they released. Big fan, had a blast with it. Next up, though, probably the easiest one that also released right around the same time is Expedition 33. So this was an interesting one because I had actually been watching and following this game since it was initially announced, and while I had expected from everything I'd seen for it to be a pretty good game, what I wasn't really expecting, and the part that blew it out of the water, for me at least, was definitely the story. I loved the story of this game. It was awesome. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed a lot of what Expedition 33 did with its sort of Western take on a JRPG, which admittedly we're seeing more and more of these days, but a lot of the systems around that were fun, and while I didn't love, everything about it, mind you, and if anything, I would say the game performed worse for me than it did for most people. That game crashed for me quite a lot. But it looks like I was actually an outlier on that front. Happens sometimes, might have been a driver issue, whatever. But by far and away, one of the most moving stories I've played in a long time. And what I enjoyed most about it was just how human all of it felt, if that makes sense, mostly because the motivations of every single character you meet were very understandable and relatable. I was able to put myself in the shoes of each one of those people and understand why they both did the things they did, and also the actions they took and how those conflicts would arise from that naturally. And it's a situation in many cases where I don't necessarily think any of them were more right than the others. Like, obviously I have my own opinions about it and I would pick one option over another, but from all angles it was just a beautiful narrative and it really blew me out of the water. I wasn't expecting that at all, which is obviously what it's doing on this list. But the next two on this list are a little more relaxed, let's say. They were absolutely better than I expected, but not admittedly to quite the degree of those first two. Kicking it off first with the first Berserker, Khazan. So I mentioned in the review for this game that it was probably the first Souls-like in a while to give me the sort of core feeling these games are meant to evoke, which is that of successfully overcoming a challenge that you've engaged with a lot. And I say that because I've honestly played and reviewed a lot of Souls-like at this point. Now, I'm not exactly Iron Pineapple, mind you, but I've played more than my fair share, to be sure, and those are the types of games where if you've played enough of them, you kind of get the gist, and some of them are a lot better at evoking that feeling of overcoming challenge than others, and the first Berserker, Khazan, really nails that feeling. In fact, I mentioned in that review as well that I spent like 6 hours fighting the last boss on the most difficult sort of version of it possible, and I honestly had a lot of fun doing that. Like, it was very hard, but I enjoyed all of it, and typically when I get stuck like that on bosses in these games, the reward at the end or having overcome it usually doesn't quite hit that high, because in a lot of ways these bosses can certainly be cheap rather than challenging, and Khazan, on the other hand, I think manages that much better than a lot of other games in the genre. In fact, that is not the only thing I enjoyed about it. I think it makes a lot of just ingenious little changes that make such an impact, like the fact that you get experience for attempting bosses and you don't lose any for actually fighting the bosses, makes it so that you can level up while making attempts at a boss, getting stronger as you go, and actually giving you that little push you need sometimes to overcome those challenges. And that on top of some honestly truly difficult bosses that still manage to feel entirely fair the whole time. And so, while as ever for Souls-likes, it's not the kind of game everybody's going to be into, but if you are into that genre, it's fantastic, and it was much, much better than I thought it was going to be, given that honestly, it's a pretty saturated genre these days. But that does bring us to our final entry, and this one is probably going to be a slightly more, I don't know, let's say controversial. And that is because it is Atomfall. So Atomfall is one of those games that I noticed people either really enjoyed it, or if they didn't like it, they really didn't like it. But it was a smaller in scope game that drew a lot of comparisons to Fallout, which I personally don't think were fitting, but I get it. I see why you wanted to make that comparison, but I didn't feel the same about it personally, which probably helped. But the gist of Atomfall is that you're stuck in this containment zone for some sort of incident, and you have to both find out what that incident was, which just so happens to coincide with you getting out of the area. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. And if you've watched the channel at all, what I play a lot of are CRPGs and things that take after various tabletop systems. And unsurprisingly then, I love a good TTRPG type of setup. And in many ways, to me, Atomfall felt like a one-shot for a tabletop setting. You're dropped into an area, you're expected to just sort of figure out what the goal is, while at the same time navigating the ins and outs of that. The game adapts to a lot of the choices you make, the people you kill, and thus you have a lot of freedom in making your way towards the end goal or the ending that you find yourself more naturally inclined to come across. And that, to me, combined with some interest around the actual event that leads to you being trapped here, was enough for me to really enjoy it. And when I was going into Atomfall, I admit I kind of expected something akin to a smaller sort of Fallout type knockoff, and much to my surprise, I think it's a game that stands on its own and has some really cool ideas in spite of its shortcomings. Now, I would say this game definitely does have some shortcomings, mind you, such as resources probably being a little too available and thus allowing you to get a little probably too overpowered too fast. I think the AI on enemies could definitely use some work, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, I enjoyed this game a lot more than I thought I would going into it, which is obviously good enough for it to get on this particular list. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.